What do Bigfoot, Stacy Arras, and my will to live have in common? I can't find any of them. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Launch. This story, once again, surrounds a national park because, of course they do. All of them do. Every time somebody goes missing, it's in a national park with this channel. I know what you're thinking. But in this case, it actually is a national park, and it's one of the big ones. It's Yosemite. As one of America's oldest national parks, Yosemite is located in eastern central California. The park covers a whopping 759,620 acres of territory across 4 counties, 95% of which is all reserved for wilderness preservation. The area was actually one of the first park areas to be federally protected by the United States government in 1864, and then became an official national park in 1890, which was still 26 years before the National Park Service even became a thing. Historically, however, the Yosemite Valley was inhabited by a group of Native Americans known as the Awanichi. These people were referred to by their neighbors, however, by a different name, something more along the lines of Yosemite. And that word, according to legend, means they are killers. The Awanichi, on the other hand, called their area Awani, and that to them meant the Big Mouth, and Awanichi would mean dwellers in the Big Mouth. Though the Awanichi went through a few different periods where they had to meld in with another local culture, they were primarily a southern Miwok people. They spoke a Utes language and may have inhabited the area for at least the last 7,000 years, which is a considerable period of time, and actually rather unusual for a lot of Native American tribes that we've talked about. Groups like the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Arapaho, even the Ute and the Navajo, all inhabited their regions for really only the last 1,000 years or shorter than that. So for a group of people to be there for the last 7,000 is considerable. This is also something we see with the Klamath peoples, who are a little bit further north of where we're talking about right now, but they have stories that seem to go back thousands upon thousands of years. At the time that the Awanichi group was actually encountered by Europeans for the first time, it was pretty well into the American settlement period. We're talking about 1830s onward here. And at the time that most of the events that concerned the Americans and the Awanichi happened, they were led by a man named Tenaya. Tenaya actually spoke to historian Lafayette Bunnell and told him some of the tribe's history, which was relayed through one of Bunnell's books. Tenaya told Bunnell that in the past, the Awanichi had been a very large, very powerful tribe, but a mixture of war and disease had forced them to abandon their tribal territories and move in with other local tribes who were willing to bring them in, and that at a certain point, they got tired of living amongst the others. Tenaya was one of those who was raised elsewhere outside of the Yosemite Valley. When Tenaya reached adulthood, he, being the new chief of the tribe, gathered together some of his father's men and told them, you know what, let's go retake our territory, let's go reclaim our land, and he led them out, and that's exactly what they did. And when they went and retook their valley, that's when they achieved the new name Yosemite. Now, according to Chief Tenaya, the reason they were called Yosemite, was because they were killers of grizzly bears, and they were renowned for being very, very good at killing grizzly bears. But according to some of the other tribes, as well as American ethnologists, it might have been more due to the fact that, in general, the southern Miwok peoples were not all that warlike, whereas the Yosemite were more aggressive than most of their neighbors and cousins. When it comes to Native American history, one of the issues that I often have is that recent scholarship is mostly meta-analysis. It is going back and looking at primary sources. It's totally appropriate historical research, but we're very rarely given new information. There's just stuff that kind of pops up, people make connections, occasionally there's a new archaeological find, but a lot of that is prehistory, and part of the reason for this is that there are not a lot of Native Americans left to tell stories, and the ones who are left often have been removed from their homeland, and as a result, they don't have quite the same ability to recount that their ancestors 100, 150 years ago had. These were people who had uninterrupted oral traditions, often in the same place that their people had lived for centuries. So for this one, I actually ended up choosing, out of the available documents, a book by Galen Clark called Indians of the Yosemite Valley, which comes from around 1900. And that document is actually the one where I first saw that, oh, the Yosemite were viewed by their neighbors as being particularly aggressive. But at the same time, Clark is very, very insistent that all of these people, compared to everybody else, were extremely peaceful. And this wasn't just in contrast to the Navajo or the Comanche or the Ute, any of those groups who had fought full-scale wars against the United States. These guys were peaceful even in relation to their own coastal Native American cousins. When it was necessary to solve internal conflicts within the nation, rather than going into open conflict with clans or tribes or even entire nations fighting one another, they would contrive a grand council. They would bring everybody together, have all of the family leaders speak, all of the important members of the tribe, and they would make decisions that way. It's actually not too dissimilar from a Norse concept known as the Althing. So when we hear that the Yosemite were unusually aggressive and they were killers, this might not be quite what springs to mind of, a well-known tribe for raiding and attacking in war, something like we heard about the Naha up in the Nahanni River Valley. Instead, we're saying that the Yosemite were just the most likely to go to war out of a group of people who, in general, were unlikely to pursue open conflict. Of course, you might be thinking, well, there's no Yosemite Indians, no Yosemite Native Americans in Yosemite National Park anymore, so what happened there? Well, the same kind of thing that happened with most of history, which was a group of people who were more technologically advanced and more bloodthirsty came in and said, this is our land now, and the people who lived there were unable to stop it. And this manifested as the Indian War of 1851, which is known today as the Mariposa War. And as with many of the other conflicts between the United States and Native American tribes, it was caused not even necessarily by the government specifically coming in and saying, hey, you don't get to stay here anymore. Instead, it was that there was no conversation between the governments, and a bunch of American settlers went in and said, hey, I like this land. And the Native Americans at first were like, that's cool, we also like this land, would you like to share? And in the year 1850, a man named James D. Savage said, yes, I would like to share, and he set up a mining camp in the Yosemite Valley. Now, prior to this, the Yosemite had not really cared much for gold. This is kind of a common theme that runs through a lot of these stories of early colonialism, partially because the Europeans really cared about gold, the natives didn't really care about gold, and they did not communicate those two things to each other very well at all. But when the Yosemite saw that they could bring gold, the little nuggets that they found, to American trading posts and trade for blankets and finished goods, things they simply could not make themselves because they didn't have the technology, they went, oh, wait a second, this currency thing, this is kind of cool. I really hope that we stick with a simple gold-backed currency forever, and that the government doesn't decide that we should simply base our money upon the power that they say it has, and make that the world's reserve currency, and then use the power of the American military to enforce the petrodollar, making the entire world dependent on a total fiat currency that is worth absolutely nothing despite having just tons of gold locked away in Fort Knox, and this causes a ton of inflation. Anyway, I'm getting away from myself. On this channel, we are gold standard stands. Anyway, point is, once they realized that they could use gold to buy goods, they started also mining gold, which was not ideal for the white settlers who kind of were counting on not having competition for the gold. Nonetheless, Galen Clark notes that the first prospectors were welcomed by the Indians with their usual friendliness and hospitality towards strangers, a universal characteristic of those tribes. And this amicability lasted for a little while, but then news of the gold in the Yosemite Valley area, well, that began to spread, and that attracted wave after wave of new miners. As we talked about in our video on Bobby Beezup, the city of Denver grew massively during the gold rush. We're talking just exponential growth, simply because of the presence of gold drawing miners in, and of course the miners needed places to stay. They needed bartenders, they needed farmers, they needed people to supply them. So you end up very quickly having entire towns and cities pop up all over the American West, and that's what was starting to happen here. Now, J.D. Savage, who had taken several native wives, decided that he was going to push his luck further by expanding deeper into Yosemite territory, and that was not something that they welcomed. Despite their protests, Clark says that thousands upon thousands of miners continued to pour in. At this point, the Yosemite, recognizing that they really didn't have control of the situation but still might be able to find a silver lining, decided to offer to lease the entire area to the miners in exchange for a portion of the gold therein. The miners, possibly well aware of the fact that they had the better support system, decided to not give in here. And it wasn't that there was any open conflict, it was just that the settlers were showing a distinct lack of respect to the people who already lived there. And when it began to impact the Yosemite's food supply, that's when things turned a little more violent. A band of Yosemite warriors were forced to raid Savage's camp because they had no food for themselves, so they went in to steal horses and supplies. And unfortunately, during that raid, they ended up killing a couple of Savage's men. While it is true that the Yosemite were starving and desperate, and this was only 2 men, this ballooned into a much larger conflict because it suddenly became a casus belli for the Californians to just drive out all of the native tribes from the Yosemite Valley. If they could say that there was too much conflict, these people were dangerous, we need to get rid of them, suddenly things were a little different. They didn't need to make treaties, they didn't need to come to agreements, they could just move in and take the territory. The California State Militia organized to go and defend Savage and also begin to push into the Yosemite Valley. Meanwhile, the Yosemite put together their own army to face off against the settlers. But it wasn't necessarily going to come to a head because cooler heads up at the top were prevailing. The governor of California, as well as the commissioner of Indian Affairs, both urged peace. They did not want this to break into a war, a conflict. It was going to be way too complicated. People on both sides were going to die. Nobody wanted that, at least not at the higher level. Down when you're talking about guys like Savage, who are having their profits very directly impacted by all of this, they were a little more antsy to secure the situation. Still, Savage did have to obey the commands of the governor. So they first went and said to all of the local tribes, hey, will you accept surrender agreements? Will you disperse, go somewhere else? Will you take money? Will you accept the overlordship of the state of California and the United States? And most of the tribes said yes. The Yosemite and 2 other bands that Clark does not name, however, retreated deeper into the mountains of the Yosemite Valley. This led to the creation of something called the Mariposa Battalion, which was commanded by James Savage himself. This was a special unit of California State Militia troops who were going to follow Savage in to clear out the remaining Native Americans, the Yosemite. Eventually, after a few months of fighting, they were able to overcome the Yosemite and their remaining allies, and those last survivors were purged from the valley. They were driven out. They did leave their mark, however, because, of course, the people who conquered the valley said, well, what are we going to name it? Let's name it after the people who lived here. Unfortunately, the Yosemite would face a total of 4 relocations between the loss of their homeland and the time they finally were placed in a settled location in 1906. The valley itself became a very popular tourist destination, and as I said before, by 1864 it received federal protection. This laid the blueprint and set the precedent for Yellowstone National Park, which would be created just 8 years later. Yosemite became a national park in its own right in 1890 when explorer John Muir successfully lobbied Congress. This resulted in a mixed protection agreement where it was technically federally protected, but California was the one doing all of the actual work. John Muir, who felt that the best entity to run this was not the California state government, then personally lobbied President Theodore Roosevelt to make it into a federally protected, federally organized national park. Roosevelt, of course, was the father of the National Forest Service. And today, as one of America's most popular national parks, Yosemite has seen a considerable amount of development into tourist attraction type things. One example would be the High Sierra Loop, and along the High Sierra Loop, Sunrise High Sierra Camp. Located at 9,400 feet above sea level, it sits just northwest of the John Muir Trail. The camp's purpose is to be a waypoint, an overnight spot where you stop, take a rest, and actually sleep in a real structure. With 9 cabins available to sleep 34 people, it's a little bit nicer than sleeping out under the stars. And on July 17, 1981, that is where 14-year-old Stacy Arras and her father George ended up. The 2 were part of a group that was on a 4-day-long horseback riding trip around the High Sierra Camp Loop. Stacy was a blonde, 5'4" tall sophomore at Westmont High School in Campbell, California, who played on the school's soccer team. They stopped sometime in the late afternoon at Sunrise High Sierra Camp and began to unpack all of their gear and get squared away for the rest of the afternoon. By the time they had everything squared away, George was pretty tired and just wanted to relax for the evening, but Stacy still had energy. She had seen a ridge, it looked pretty. She decided she was going to go take some pictures. She asked her father to go with her, but as he wasn't feeling up to a hike, he decided, you know what, no, you can go on your own. According to her father, Stacy was very experienced with the mountains, especially for a girl her age, even though she wasn't familiar with the specific Sunrise High Sierra area. However, Stacy would not be alone because another man, an unnamed 77-year-old who was along for the horseback riding trip with them, offered to tag along with Stacy. The exact details of how this interaction happened aren't clear, but from interviews with George, it's clear that at the time, he was pretty okay with it. Not only was he confident that Stacy could handle herself, but they had also been riding with the man all day. Interestingly, a bunch of versions of this story claim that Stacy had been planning to wear flip-flops for her hike, and her dad suggested that she wear hiking boots. This is usually used to discount the possibility that she was planning to run away, but I think that there's better options for explaining why she wasn't planning to run away, including the fact that she invited her father to go along in the first place, and then had another person going along with her second. I couldn't find anything on the detail about the flip-flops. I'm not entirely sure where that came from, but it's not in any of the news reporting from the time, nor is it in any of the National Park Service reports. Either way, Stacy and the unnamed 77-year-old man set off together, although a lot of the contemporary stories don't make it super clear which direction they were going. An article in the San Francisco Examiner mentions that Stacy was bolting up the switchbacks, with the 77-year-old struggling to keep up behind her. At one point it says that she was waiting for him several hundred yards away up the trail. Another article, this one in the Fresno Bee from July 20th, 1981, says that the 77-year-old accompanied her for 20 to 30 minutes before he became tired and either sat down on a log to rest or turned back, depending on which story you're reading from which paper. So what are we looking for? We're looking for a trail that is at least several hundred yards long, including switchbacks that also leads to a lake. That gives us the Sunrise Lakes Trail, which heads west right out of Sunrise High Sierra Camp. And that trail runs for about 1.5 miles up to Sunrise Lake number 3. Now, of course, I did not find this out until after, but exactly one article does in fact mention where they were going, and it is also from the San Francisco Examiner, and it says that they were in fact headed on the Sunrise Lakes Trail. But I didn't find that excerpt until I finished doing all of the logic. So it seems likely that Stacy and our mystery gentleman took the Sunrise Lakes Trail for about 20 to 30 minutes before eventually separating. According to the mystery man, Stacy was doing just fine. He wasn't super concerned. After all, it wasn't that far away, and there were likely to be people on the trail she was on anyway. But after several hours, when Stacy still hadn't reappeared, it was determined that, you know what, maybe we should go look for her. By 10:30 p.m. that evening, staff, volunteers, and of course Stacy's father were all spread out around the camp looking for her. Bright and early the next morning, July 18th, 1981, the National Park Service and their partners were in full swing. At least 50 people took part in the first day of searching, and about half of those were professionals, with the other half being volunteers, both experienced and inexperienced. One example would be San Jose Search and Rescue, who had a 9-man team who were tasked with some of the more treacherous terrain. We're talking ravines and creek drainages. Those orange jumpsuit-clad mountain climbers noted to reporters exactly how treacherous all of this terrain was. They were in legitimate danger themselves, even with their ropes, their climbing gear, and all of their protocols. If Stacy had made it into any of these locations they were in, it probably hadn't gone well for her. And the San Jose guys were actually there volunteering. They were not paid to be there. Additional assistance was also rendered by Bay Area Mountain Rescue and Sierra Madre Mountain Rescue, as well as, of course, the National Park Service. The 5-square-mile search area was determined by natural formations that they decided would most likely be impassable to a 14-year-old girl. Places where she either couldn't overcome the terrain or a rationally thinking person wouldn't try to overcome the terrain, such as rivers, cliff faces, and ravines. Once the search area was established, about 90 to 100 people took part in very meticulous, organized grid searches, going yard by yard to make sure that they didn't miss anything. Also on the ground were 8 dog teams, including a Linda Stoner and her 2-year-old German Shepherd, Duke. While typically we talk about bloodhounds for tracking, shepherds are also useful, but a little bit less specific. You give them a scent and they will go find that person. They're not exactly cadaver dogs, they're not exactly bloodhounds, they won't be quite as accurate as quick, but they are solid search dogs all the same. However, search dogs in general, while they can be extremely useful in optimal conditions, their effectiveness quickly degrades when you add in certain weather conditions. In this case, it was very dry, dusty, and windy, which meant that stuff that had Stacy's scent on it was getting blown all over the place. 3 helicopters also were in the area helping look from the sky, but they failed to turn up any clues. By Thursday, July 23rd, it was looking pretty bad for the search. There was a final surge of volunteers that following weekend, but still, they came up with absolutely nothing. People searched all day Saturday and Sunday, and divers even combed lake beds, but still, no clues, no evidence that Stacy had even been on that mountain. On Monday, July 27th, the search ended without a single clue found. Now, you may have heard this story before, and you may be going, well, wait, what about the lens cap? Well, when Stacy disappeared, she was wearing an off-white windbreaker, white jersey blouse, striped shorts, gray hiking boots, anklet, and carrying an Olympus camera. And according to some tellings of this story, the lens cap for that exact model Olympus camera was found either on a rock or a log right next to Sunrise Lake number 3. The lens cap detail is popular because it suggests a final known location for Stacy, aside from just somewhere on the trail. Additionally, a lot of the Missing 411 stories, if we're going by the Missing 411 profile established by David Paulides, those often involve water. If she went missing right next to the lake, that involves water. That gives it another Missing 411 profile point. The problem with that is, I can find no evidence of a lens cap being found anywhere. It's not in any of the original reporting, it's not in any official report, and the only place I'm seeing it is websites that I've caught being inaccurate before. Now, it could be that I missed a detail somewhere, but again, as far as all of the documentation that is contemporary and official goes, they found nothing. In fact, all the evidence points to the opposite of this, that there was not a lens cap. In fact, in a letter from Park Superintendent Robert Binowitz to David McCoy of Mammoth Mountain Ski Patrol, thanking him for their assistance, he specifies that not a single clue was found. In my opinion, a lens cap for the camera she had would have been considered a clue. And though the search was ended, and for all intents and purposes Stacy Arras is considered dead, her father George went back year after year to check crevices and various ravines and spots that they might have just missed for any trace of Stacy, any of her belongings, her remains, something. Unfortunately, she's never been found. So then the question becomes, what happened here? A number of theories have sprung up about Stacy's disappearance, some of which are rather supernatural, some of which are rather mundane. One popular claim is that Stacy just ran away. She was known to have been going through some family stuff at home, and she's also said to have been missing her teenage boyfriend. Both of these details appear to have come from her father, but the problem with that is that it makes very little sense for her to run away in these circumstances. She asked her father to go with her, she then asked another person to go with her. That's not really something you do before you run away. Also, why run away on a mountain a day into riding into the wilderness? And, of course, on top of all of this, most of the troubles she was dealing with at home were not runaway worthy. It was just simple 14-year-old drama with their parents stuff. For those reasons, a runaway situation seems unlikely to me. Another of the mundane yet popular claims is that Stacy was kidnapped. She did vanish without a trace, and no body was ever found, which would imply that she was not in the park. On the other hand, the nearest road was 5 miles away, and that was as the crow flies, not along the trail. Additionally, there were people coming up that trail while Stacy was missing who said that they did not see her at any point. And for those wondering about the 77-year-old man, well, on the one hand, he probably could have hurt her if he was in good enough shape. She was still only 5'5" and 120 pounds, but also, he couldn't have taken her out of the park, and he probably couldn't have taken her all that far to get her away, so the idea that he took her out of the search area, unlikely. One of the most likely possibilities, however, is that Stacy fell into a ravine or hurt herself, got stuck, tried to look for cover, and ended up just succumbing to the elements. In terms of what is likely, one of the most popular theories is that Stacy simply fell into a ravine, got stuck somewhere, just wasn't able to get out, and that she unfortunately succumbed to her injuries. She would have been very hard to see while injured, especially if she was unconscious and able to call for help, and she was seen climbing a little bit recklessly. Additionally, Stacy did not say she was going to the lake. She said she was going to a ridge that was a short distance down the trail away. The plan was, I believe, to go up the ridge, which was higher than the lake, and photograph the lake from the ridge. So, if they considered that ridge impassable, they may not have checked, but I can't say for certain if they did comb the ridge. Either way, there was still no body. It could be that they just weren't able to see the body, that they walked right past it and missed it, but again, you know, it's without specific details, without going and actually visiting the place, it's really hard to say. And then there's a less accepted theory, which I feel the need to present nonetheless. Some have suggested that Stacy Arras was kidnapped by Bigfoot. And while I would like to be able to say that there is absolutely no evidence for this, there is enough weirdness going on that I do have to consider the possibility that in some capacity, that's not entirely improbable. The first thing to establish here is that David Paulides claims that he had a lot of trouble getting his hands on Stacy Arras' case files. He submitted a FOIA request, but was rejected under Exemption 7A, which allows the government to refuse on the grounds that information received could interfere with law enforcement. He appealed the decision, but it was rejected, and he claims that over the phone, a lawyer for the National Park Service told him he was never getting those files. The weird part about that is, there was no real suspicion of foul play. It was something that was considered as part of the routine investigation process, but at no point was this ever likely a foul play case as far as the investigators were concerned, which means it's not really a criminal investigation, and it doesn't make sense to reject on those grounds. In fact, at the time of the request, there was no active investigation into Stacy's whereabouts. For that reason, Stacy's files should not have been exempt from FOIA. The only reason it would be exempt from FOIA under Exception 7A is if this was in fact an ongoing criminal investigation. And for those curious, yes, technically the National Park Service is considered law enforcement because it does have law enforcement powers. In terms of what David was able to get his hands on and what has been released by the National Park Service, one thing that I noticed off the bat was exactly how limited the files were. When we compare it to Dennis Martin or Chuck McCullough, for whom there were dozens and dozens of pages of files, Stacy Arras only has 21, and for the most part, they're just pictures and newspaper clippings. So there's the fact that the National Park Service was being cagey about the information in this case, which is weird, but there's got to be more to it than that if we're going to posit that Bigfoot was involved, right? Well, the location is not terribly far away from another spot in the Sierra Nevadas that we've talked about, known as the Sierra Camp, and famously, it is the origin of the Sierra Camp tapes. That camp rests somewhere between Yosemite and Lake Tahoe. The exact location is not ever given, but in 1971, Ron Moorhead and his friends, who were up there hunting, began to experience some strange phenomena. They were hearing these strange whooping sounds coming from the darkness around them, but they couldn't see the location or the source. When they would hear these sounds, they would get inside of their makeshift shelter and just hope that whatever was out there was going to go away. And on a couple of occasions, Moorhead thought, I should probably record this. Al Berry, who was a journalist friend of Moorhead's, decided that he was going to come along for a couple of these trips, mainly with the intention of disproving this, of getting it on camera that nothing interesting at all was going on, because Al Berry was not a Bigfoot believer. But, talking about one of those trips, he did in fact say, "As dusk became dark night, something approached camp from above, and when it arrived, two voices that I could discern, it vocalized, and the sounds carried through the trees as I have never heard human voices carry." Now, I listened to those tapes, and our full analysis of this entire situation is actually already on this channel in a video titled Missing 411, the Sierra Camp Tapes, and Bigfoot, if you want to go look at the full thing, but we'll address some of it briefly here. On the recording, I hear at least 2, possibly 3 or even 4 voices distinct from Al Berry and Ron Moorhead, anybody in the shelter. There are voices that are coming from outside. There's a mix of some hooting sounds, some laughter, and what really to me does sound like speech, just not in any language I've ever heard. The eerie part is that it sounds like there are multiple speakers not just vocalizing, but conversing. And there's some pretty compelling evidence that they would have to be quite large to make those sounds. As I said, we have an entire video on this. You're welcome to go check it out. I told you which one it is. I'll try and link it in the description if I remember. But if you tie all of that in with the stories we get of the Saskets from the Coast Salish people of British Columbia, a picture starts to take shape. In fact, the term Sasquatch comes from Canadian journalist and teacher J.W. Burns, who spent a few years with these Native Americans. Burns had heard the stories before, but it was only when he got there and started interacting with the people of these tribes that he realized how deep their belief went. He recounted a tale told to him by an indigenous man named Peter, and Peter, to use his English name, told Burns about a time that he had been out hunting and he came across what he thought was a bear. But when it stood up, it became clear to him that this was not a bear. This was a 6.5 to 7 foot tall, very hairy man. And Burns also spoke to a squaw man by the name of Charlie Victor who had some stories of his own. He spoke of a time, a hunting trip with some friends, where they came across a very strange sight. It was an opening in the side of a mountain with a very large boulder next to it. And according to them, that hole in the mountain simply should not have been there. They went home and they told the elders about it, and the elders seemed completely unsurprised and said, "Oh, that's where the Saskets live, don't go back there." These being young men, they of course went back, and what they found was that the hole was gone, and the boulder was in a different spot. And it occurred to them, oh, something moved that boulder in front of the entrance. And when you look at these stories of the Saskets, they're always described as being larger than men, very hairy. We're talking like 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall, very hairy, very broad, very fast, very strong, and in some cases capable of human speech. And there's a bit of a disagreement. Some of the native sources are very clear that the Saskets are not Native Americans. They are not human beings just like you and me. In other cases, they say that they're like us, but they're not quite us. They're our cousins. And since we had to bring up the father of the national park system through the National Forest Service, Teddy Roosevelt, there's also an odd story that Teddy Roosevelt told in The Wilderness Hunter, a book that he wrote in 1893. And in the book, it's referred to as a goblin story. I've also seen this referred to as a Wendigo story or a Bigfoot story. In general, it's just kind of a weird story. The story was allegedly recounted to him by a man named Bauman, who some have suggested may in fact be Roosevelt himself, giving himself a bit of separation from this story for his own political good. Bauman's story takes place on the Idaho-Montana border at a place called Wisdom River. Bauman and his companion are simply not having any success hunting. They head up into a mountain pass, and apparently the year earlier, some prospectors had found 2 dead men who appeared to have been eaten in that same pass. They hike about 4 hours into some dense forest and set up camp. There's still a little daylight remaining at this point, so they walk around, they explore a little bit, and when they get back, they found that a bear has kind of torn their camp apart. There are a whole bunch of tracks laying around, but they don't really pay them any mind because they just figured this was a bear and they've got other important stuff to do. Now they know there's a bear in the area. But as Bauman gets to preparing dinner, his companion goes and looks at the tracks. And he calls Bauman over. He says, Bauman. Bauman walks over, looks at the tracks, and his companion says, "The bear has been walking on 2 legs." Bauman laughs, but he notices that the bear does appear to have been walking on 2 legs, which bears can do. They typically don't, because they have no good reason to. It's really only if their front paws are injured that they will walk around on 2 legs consistently. And there's more to the story. At midnight, they see this looming beast, and Bauman shoots at it, but it runs off, and then they go out hunting again, and the camp ends up destroyed a second time. The story goes on, but the gist of it is that Teddy Roosevelt was telling a story transmitted to us through a man named Bauman about something up in the American Northwest that was large, very destructive, and not a bear. If you want the full story with all the details, it's in the same video as everything else that we've talked about tonight, which is Missing 411, the Sierra Camp tapes, and Bigfoot. As for Stacy Arras, however, in my opinion, the most likely outcome here is that she did get up to that ridge, and unfortunately probably slipped, fell, hit her head, and was never found. It's a sad version of the events. It's, unfortunate, but it does seem to be the most likely. Occam's razor here. The only thing is that they've never found a body. Of course, it's possible they just missed the body, or that she was outside of the search area already by the time she perished. But with the evidence being what it is, that seems most likely to me. On the other hand, I'm not opposed to the idea of something like Bigfoot, not big hairy, ape-man Bigfoot, but something more like the Saskets living up in the mountains. I'm a little bit more intrigued by that idea. I'm not going to take it wholesale and say it's true, but we used to say that the Wendigo was doing this, so you know what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's not totally ridiculous that the Saskets could be up to something. But I think I would want to go and take a look at it myself first, see the area in person before I come to any sort of conclusion either way. So like I said, I'm pretty much leaning towards just she messed up here, but at the same time, I'm open to other possibilities. But of course, this is a YouTube channel. There's a comment section. You can let us know what you think. And if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us on Patreon for $1 a month or more. It's an option. You can do it. Either way, thank you. You can also check out our show live on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. here on the Lore Lodge. We have 2 other channels now, the History Hut and the Weird Bible. Each has a podcast at the moment. Both will be getting sit-down recorded content. I know I've been saying that for months, but we actually are getting closer to it now. I promise. We jumped the gun. I'm sorry. You can also check out Lore Lodge merch at thelorelodge.shop. We got some fun shirts and designs that we have actually had done through a graphic designer. My best friend, Norman Keys, is awesome. Go check him out on the architecture Instagrams. And if you're like me right at this exact moment, you're probably pretty tired. So if you want to wake up, check out the Lore Lodge coffee, Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company. I made cold brew with it earlier. It's delicious. It's way better than Starbucks, and I highly recommend it. And it's very reasonably priced coffee, honestly. We made a point of that. But with all of that said, I am Aiden Madison. Thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.